In the last few months, I've been really getting into philosophy that beckon us to take action. And what I mean by this is characters such as David Goggins and Joe Rogan like to talk about this concept a lot. They like to talk about this concept of learning how to welcome obstacles instead of running away from them. Almost trying to rewire the brain to function differently when it comes to fear and stress. And I noticed that I really needed this, you know. There've been plenty of times throughout my life where I would run into a problem and just not know what to do exactly and how to tackle them. And for some reason, it has never occurred to me that this was an issue that I had. I've always thought that I've mastered my mind in some extent due to the fact that I've wholly and fully embraced my identity as someone who has a mental illness. But what really got me thinking about this specifically and what brought it to consciousness is what happened a few months ago around the time of April. And what happened was I had a job change that was extremely jarring, and I was thrown into a job where I did not have too much experience and felt myself drowning in the amount of workload and the amount of responsibilities. And given that there was almost zero support given to me, it started trickling into my mind that I couldn't do this job. And yes, I went on Reddit and I went on all these forums just to see if it's a normal kind of feeling to have. And I realized that yes, maybe other people do experience this sort of imposter syndrome of starting a new job, but for some reason, I just couldn't seem to handle it. And day by day, I would dread going to work. And day by day, I would play the horrible moments that I experienced at work over and over again in my head. And no amount of self-talk seemed to be enough to pull myself out of that hole. What happened eventually was I ended up in hospital, and subsequently I was let go of my job. Now, why I'm talking about this is extremely related to my obsession with Berserk, especially after everything had happened. And this is also linked with characters like David Goggins, where I'm at this stage in life where I am feeling once again a bit lost. I just turned 29 years old, and ever since April, I have been trying extremely hard to once again remaster my mind. Or I guess in this case, actually mastering the mind, because I realized that in the past few months, or no, not even the past few months, in the past few years, I've always had this confidence that my mental illness will never come back again. And this sense of hubris is what caused my downfall the moment I changed jobs. Now, Goggins' philosophy isn't just about welcoming obstacles, but it's about welcoming stress into your mind and also welcoming suffering. Now, suffering is something that he loves to talk about, and he loves to discuss the importance of suffering in order to succeed. And success in this matter isn't merely physical pursuits, but it can be applied to many things, including mental, intellectual, and career aspects. Now, you're probably wondering, why am I talking so much about all these ideas about suffering and obstacles? Well, the reason I brought this up today is because the latest release of chapter 367 of Berserk helps represent these ideas that I've been talking about. If we take a look at the character of Guts once again, we realize that he bears a lot of similarities to a character like David Goggins, in the sense that he is a being who has suffered his entire life, but he is still out there fighting and existing and thriving in his suffering. And this has always been, I believe, the core reason why I am so obsessed with this manga. I have always had this strong obsession with strong-willed characters, and I've always thought that, man, maybe it's because I admire them so much, and I don't believe it that someone like them could be humanly attainable. So characters like Zoro from One Piece, Guts from Berserk, have always made me feel so inspired to do something, yet I never actually went out to do the work. But when I started looking at more real-life role models, such as David Goggins, I started to realize that I was putting a limiter in my mind on what I should and should not do, or what I was scared to do. And I've always thought I've conquered my own fear on everything, but that was just a lie I set up in order to run away from my fears without any sense of accountability. Now, if we take a look at chapter 367 of Berserk, the first thing that we realize is that we see a part of Griffith's character once again, that reflection of devastation that we're so used to. Just like when he tainted the love child of Casca and Guts right after the eclipse, or I guess during the eclipse, and what resulted was a corrupted fetus that wasn't even capable of being born before being absolutely tainted. And once again, in this scenario, in this environment, he acts as a destructive vehicle, an unwelcomed one, who's capable of tainting purity And this is announced by the Queen of the Lands, where she states that everything will break apart and then that a rising tide from the depths of earth will come. And an interesting note here that I've kind of discovered is that we see how Griffith's overall image, it defeats his true inner character. But the same thing goes for Guts. And what I mean by this is that we see Griffith as this angelic being. And the first thing that comes to mind is something that is pure and righteous. However, his real intentions are nothing but. He has done extremely evil things and extremely selfish things. And every part of his actions benefit himself only. And even though they are disguised as altruistic actions, if one was to dig deep into his intentions, we will start to realize that everything he does is motivated by his personal desire. Whereas for Guts, it's very different. It's inversely different by the fact that he has a very harsh, evil-looking exterior. However, his internal struggles demonstrate that he is nowhere near, or he isn't even remotely close to how evil Griffith is. And it can be argued that Griffith chose a relatively easier and selfish path after experiencing just one or two big obstacles, whereas Guts as a character has the entire weight of the world on his shoulders, and he also hasn't stopped struggling or suffering throughout his entire life. Now, when Griffith touches Casca, it immediately has my belly turning with hatred. Since if you're an old viewer of Berserk like I am, we have been through so much of Guts and Casca's debilitating relationship throughout this series that it is only natural for Guts to become enraged when any form of contact has been made from Griffith to Casca. And also the fact that Guts' sword doesn't even scratch Griffith also demonstrates that this is the next level of development for Guts' character, his next challenge to overcome. Throughout this series, Guts has struggled and fought so much, and yet he's still unable to even slightly match Griffith in terms of power. And to a lot of people, this seems like a very devastating truth. It seems like a very, well, I trained so hard and what for? I can barely scratch the obstacle that's in front of me. However, even though this demonstrates the fragility of the human condition, what blows my mind is the fact that Guts shatters this, right? He shatters this idea of fragility with his own personal will, his own autonomous, unrelenting will to not only protect Casca from this great evil, but also to destroy Griffith for his horrible crime. And he has used this sense of vengeance to propel him forward, to continue to fight, and not let emotions of negativity drag him down to a blubbering mess. Now, at this point in the chapter, we start to see a huge crack in the ground form. And many think that, oh, it's probably the weight of Guts' sword and the power of his move that caused this, but I believe that is incorrect. If we take a look at what the witch doctor said in a previous page, we see that she says that something emerges from the earth. Now, we don't know what it is yet. It hasn't been revealed in this chapter, but I'd like to really just quickly talk about the significance of this crack and how it seems to relate to the Griffith's character and the development of this entire story. A crack in an island this big is quite iconic and can arguably be seen as an extremely significant biblical connotation. If we take a look at the biblical story of the splitting of the temple veil in Hebrews chapter 9, we see that there bears a huge significance between the two. In the Bible, we see that the tearing of the temple curtain right after the death of Jesus Christ symbolized an end of an old covenant through animal sacrifice and the beginning of a new covenant. And this sounds extremely familiar to what we know in regards to sacrifice in Berserk. However, instead of a character like Jesus who is righteous and pure and a symbol of salvation, in some sick twisted way, Griffith is being characterized as some sort of unwelcomed messiah, and he's not here to bring salvation, but instead to bring chaotic destruction and disgusting evil instead. This is further reinforced if you think about Moonboy. Moonboy being resurrected, in a sense, is something that was unwelcomed. It was something that symbolized Griffith as some unwanted spirit, unwanted being, unwanted deity to come spread his evil in a place that is supposedly pure, wonderful, and heavenly. And I find this extremely interesting because it kind of talks about the idea of a holy deity, but from a different perspective. It comes from the perspective of people who actually know the truth about the character. A lot of times we put people on a pedestal and believe that they are as great as they are made out to be. And this is significant in the story, especially to people in the general public who decide that Griffith has come down from the heavens to save them without knowing the full story about his background. However, we know the extent of his evil and we know the extent of his power, and that he is willing to do whatever it takes to achieve his own personal desires and dreams. And if we continue on this chapter, we start to see Griffith carrying Casca around the island, well, at least holding onto her throughout this whole ordeal. And Griffith grabbing Casca and leading her away gives a sense of tranquility and protective nature to the normal eye if this was ripped out of a page and given to someone with no context. However, this is an extremely sinister and revolting act in a multitude of ways. Throughout the story of Berserk, Griffith has always been an embodiment of betrayal. First and foremost, his external appearance and actions lead the general public to believe he is a savior and messiah sent down to better the world, as discussed before, when in actuality his selfish greed for power and desire is at the forefront of his purpose. And in this panel, exactly, what seems to be an innocent display of salvation, love, and compassion is in fact a captured moment of lust, evil, and impurity. You just have to look close. If we look closely, you notice that Griffith is grabbing Casca's right breast, an act that he has only done once before in this series, which was during the eclipse when he brutally raped her in front of gods as a demonstration of his power and lack of humanity. Now, this panel demonstrates his ill intentions and that they are not pure at all, but something sinister and extremely invasive. And a similar thing can be seen in this panel if we take a look at the ground. Now, throughout these last few chapters, we've begun to realize how beautiful and how pure this heavenly land is, this land of elves. However, this once beautiful field of natural grass and pretty flowers has seemingly become engulfed by an unwanted sentient cloud or sludge, seemingly to have violated what was once considered a heavenly haven that was safe and happy. This chapter was extremely well drawn and written, but at the same time, we know that this is only an extension of what the original author wanted it to be. You can tell by the artwork and the style of drawing, as well as the way the story is being told. It seems to be a lot more rushed and less nuanced to a certain degree. However, I solemnly believe we don't currently have a right to really complain about it, especially because this is merely a continuance of the original story based off someone's memories before the author passed away. And yeah, I'm just extremely excited to see what comes, and also extremely excited to see how this amazing manga series will eventually end.